presentation on Zoom, but streaming's working. And just to note, if you are on Zoom, we are going to have a Q&A session after, so you can put a chat in there, or if you have my cell phone, those who are online, you can text me, and I'll share any questions that you have via text if there's time at the end of Dr. Porwancher's presentation. So good morning to everyone. We have had a wonderful guest scholar weekend, and we are grateful to the Weingold family as well as our Men's Club and Sisterhood for making this weekend possible with Dr. Andrew Porwancher. Just a very short bio for those who have not yet learned with him. He is the author of The Jewish World of Alexander Hamilton, and he received his PhD from Cambridge. He grew up in Princeton, New Jersey, has held fellowships at Harvard, Princeton, and Oxford, and he is currently a professor, a tenured professor at the University of Oklahoma in constitutional law, as well as Jewish studies and Jewish history, and it's been an engaging weekend. His talks will be available on our YouTube and streaming pages later this week for any talks that you missed. And with pleasure, we are now here for our last presentation, Peace at Portsmouth, American Jews and the Great Russian Blunder. Dr. Porwancher.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm so grateful to your congregation for hosting me, and as this is my last of the 4 talks, I just want to take a moment to once again thank your rabbi, your program director, your president, all of the leadership, to the great staff, the people doing the food and the security, the volunteers, and all of you who I've met who have shared your stories. This is a remarkable congregation, an incredibly international congregation. It's great to meet people who are from Cleveland and have stories going back to their family being here from the 19th century, and other people who in the great Jewish tradition have come here from other places. And I just found out that you have a 600-year-old Torah scroll, which I've been promised a glimpse of after the talk. And so this has just been a really wonderful weekend, and I know I speak for Kristen when I say how much we appreciate being welcomed with such open arms. And so with that, let us turn to the story of peace at Portsmouth. By the thousands, spectators descended on Washington, D.C. to see the inauguration of Theodore Roosevelt. They spent the morning of March 4th, 1905, under a canopy of clouds that seemed to threaten rain. But as the noon hour approached, so did the sunlight. TR would have sufficient opportunity to savor his 2-mile journey from the White House to the Capitol building. After all, his carriage was escorted by slow-moving Civil War veterans. One newspaper recorded that these veterans were, quote, fast approaching the scripture limit of life. A steady wind ensured that the countless flags lining Pennsylvania Avenue were blowing with due enthusiasm for the occasion. Outside the east wing of the Capitol, where a crowd began to gather, those agile enough to climb trees enjoyed superior vantage points to the throngs below. When Roosevelt finally emerged on the dais, the mass of onlookers erupted with excitement. One newspaper recorded, "The shouting began, swelling into a roar like Niagara, rising to cyclonic effects." TR was accompanied by esteemed personages from across the federal government, justices of the Supreme Court, members of Congress, the leaders of the Army and Navy, and foreign dignitaries as well. As per tradition, the Chief Justice administered the oath of office on a Bible, and after Roosevelt finished reciting the words prescribed by the Constitution, he touched his lips to the Bible and began his inaugural address. Nearly 4 years earlier, Roosevelt had been sworn in a parlor in Buffalo amid the fright and grief of President McKinley's assassination. Now, TR stood on the steps of the U.S. Capitol before an adoring multitude, not as a deputy, who had become head of state by default, but as the winner of the presidency in his own right. A newly emboldened Roosevelt turned his attention to America's emerging place in the international arena. He declared to the crowd, "We have become a great nation, forced by the fact of its greatness into relations with the other nations of the earth, and we must behave as beseems a people with such responsibilities." Roosevelt and the nation alike had reached remarkable heights of power despite their relative youth. The dominant issue in the global arena at that time may sound familiar to you. Imagine, if you will, that Russia is led by a petty dictator who is divorced from reality and suffers illusions of grandeur. He recklessly plunges Russia into a needless military conflict in a bid to expand its territory over land to which Russia has no rightful claim. But Russia's foe stuns the world with its surprising resilience. A protracted struggle between the two nations leaves Russia alienated on the world stage. Its economy is teetering, and signs of social unrest within Russia's borders seem to threaten the stability of the regime. Such was the state of affairs between Russia and Japan, who were vying over rival imperial ambitions in the Far East, in Manchuria and in Korea. Within a week of Roosevelt's festivities, the president redoubled his efforts to serve as peacemaker between the warring parties. Roosevelt's motivations for seeking a negotiated peace with Russia and Japan were complex. Now, early in the war, Roosevelt, like the American people at large, favored Japan. Roosevelt had little regard for a Russian nation that persecuted its Jewish population at home and was deceitful in its relations abroad. Unsurprisingly, Roosevelt's closest Jewish advisor, Oscar Strauss, was of similar mind. As the war commenced, Strauss wrote to the president, "Japan is certainly battling on the side of civilization. May wisdom and victory be on her side." Japan's superiority in troop training, in weapons technology, in intelligence gathering, all redounded to Russia's detriment. TR thrilled to Japan's surprising series of victories early in the war. But by late 1904, Roosevelt's delight was turning into dismay. The Japanese seemed poised to unconditionally crush the Russians and thereby dominate the Far East, and not in a manner, Roosevelt feared, that would be conducive to American interests. Roosevelt believed that if he could seek a negotiated peace between the belligerent parties before Russia's total collapse, he might well ensure a balance of power in the Far East, one that would redound to America's own benefit in the region. And beyond this level of practical geopolitics, Roosevelt genuinely believed that war was an evil to be truncated whenever possible. He would later reflect in his autobiography, quote, "The losses of life and of treasure were frightful," in referencing the Russo-Japanese War. True, this was the same Roosevelt who had lusted for blood in the Spanish-American War, but Roosevelt had a talent for inhabiting a contradiction with a remarkable ease. And so, shortly after his second term begins, Roosevelt instructs his Secretary of State, John Hay, to make discreet overtures to the warring parties that the American president was willing to broker a peace. Both Russia and Japan were exhausted by war, but hamstrung by pride. The Japanese, enjoying the superior position, were in theory amenable to finding a peace with Russia, but only on one lopsided terms that Russia would be destined to reject. And the Russians, for their part, were determined to carry on a losing struggle. Such was the arrogance of an autocracy that believed itself immune from facts on the ground. Roosevelt asked Hay, "Did you ever know anything more pitiable than the condition of Russian despotism? The Tsar is a preposterous little creature. He has been unable to make war, and he is now unable to make peace." The reluctant Japanese eventually signaled their amenability to Roosevelt finding a path to the table in late April of 1905. But Russia was proving obstinate. The Russians were letting their vainglory override their material interests, for they could hardly afford to fight much longer. Russia was then enduring not only an embarrassing succession of military defeats abroad, but extraordinary internal discord at home. In early 1905, a peaceful demonstration by labor protesters in the Russian capital of St. Petersburg culminated with Russian troops killing 130 of their own civilians. Known as Bloody Sunday, this massacre badly damaged the standing of the Tsar with his people, and it touched off months of domestic unrest. The strife roiled Russian society from peasants to professionals, from city-side to countryside. Additional waves of worker strikes culminated in more lethal clashes between protesters and soldiers. Meanwhile, radicals orchestrated political assassinations, including of a high-ranking member in the Tsar's own family. The unrest was not centrally organized, and the fragmented nature of the resistance allowed Tsar Nicholas to retain his hold on power for the time being, but it was unclear how much longer he would be able to maintain his grip. Unsurprisingly, Russia's lackluster military performance against Japan exacerbated the rebellion within Russia's borders. In symbolic terms, the losses in the Far East seem to epitomize the ineptitude and corruption of the autocracy. In practical terms, the war exacted a severe toll on Russia's economy. Still, the Tsar pushed blindly forward until late May, when a devastating naval loss, combined with significant coaxing from the Roosevelt administration, finally brought the Russians to the table. Oscar Strauss, with his characteristically purple prose, wrote to the president to congratulate Roosevelt for what he called, quote, a triumph in humanitarian diplomacy. But TR knew that the difficult work had only just begun. Simply clearing a path to the bargaining table would prove difficult. As Roosevelt told Strauss, I've been having a curious time. I have been endeavoring to get Russia and Japan to go to The Hague. Curiously enough, Russia is most reluctant, and Japan positively refuses. Now, both countries were willing to meet in Washington, D.C., but Roosevelt himself had doubts about Washington owing to the heat that engulfs the nation's capital every summer. And so Roosevelt began considering New England coastal towns, which could offer the twin benefits of balmy weather and relative seclusion. Bar Harbor, Maine, and Newport, Rhode Island held strong appeal, but it was ultimately the picturesque town of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where they won the honors of playing host. Neither Russia nor Roosevelt yet knew that the Portsmouth Peace Conference would present an opportunity for American Jews to challenge high-ranking Russian officials over the pernicious anti-Semitism that still found free rein under Tsarist rule. In the midst of the preparations for the peace conference, Secretary of State John Hay's already poor health began deteriorating further. Earlier that year, Oscar Strauss had written to the president exclaiming, "No nation has so wise and so capable a minister of foreign affairs as we have in Mr. Hay." Hay soldiered ahead with his duties in the first half of 1905, but his ultimate fate was approaching sooner than anyone realized or wanted to believe. On July 1st, with the peace conference just weeks away, John Hay took his final breath. American Jews in particular felt the loss of a statesman who had taken a strong humanitarian stand on behalf of American Jewry. on behalf of Russian Jewry. Russian Jews at that time faced the twin horrors of legal discrimination at the hands of the state and extra-legal violence at the hands of anti-Semitic mobs. It is a striking fact that the only memorial service honoring Hay upon his passing took place at a synagogue on the Lower East Side. Although temperatures in the city reached 87 degrees that day, with the humidity lending the air a sultry quality, Jews packed into the Rivington Street synagogue. Women and children sat in the balcony with an American flag draped, covered in black streamers as befitting a mourning ceremony. The men huddled below to a person were wearing black ties. People who had never met Secretary Hay were openly weeping as if a beloved family member had passed. The service was late to begin owing to the delayed arrival of Henry Goldfogle, the Jewish congressman who represented the Lower East Side in the House. For an interminable hour, the crush of people waited in the heat. Finally, Congressman Goldfogle arrived. And in his eulogy, he notably set aside his partisan differences. He was a Democrat, Roosevelt and Hay were Republicans, but Goldfogle saw fit to praise not just the late secretary, but the sitting president as well. In Goldfogle's words, with Theodore Roosevelt, in calling attention to the indignation of Americans at the Russian outrages on the Jews, John Hay made himself heard even in darkest Russia. Meanwhile, another Jewish leader, Adolf Krauss, was making his own arrangements in advance of the peace conference. Krauss was the newly installed head of B'nai B'rith, which was at the time, actually I guess still is, the oldest Jewish organization in America. He was from Chicago, he was politically adept, he had managed a successful mayoral campaign in the Windy City, and he saw in Portsmouth a potential forum to champion the cause of Russian Jewry. Perhaps the embattled Russian regime, reeling from military defeat and internal discord, could be persuaded in this moment of crisis to relent in its persecution of Jewry. Russia was dispatching one of its leading officials, Count Sergei Witte, to America for negotiations with the Japanese. Witte was considered a reformer, at least by Russian standards, and his wife, a convert to Christianity, had initially been Jewish. Maybe Witte would agree to meet with the delegation of American Jewish leaders. And if those leaders could convince Witte of a humane answer to Russia's so-called Jewish question, then perhaps Witte in turn could persuade the Tsar. And when I use the phrase the Jewish question, I'm referring to a phrase that was used in various places in Europe to describe debates from the 18th century into the 20th about the proper civil status of Jews in those countries, about whether Jews would be emancipated, that is to say, granted formal legal equality. Adolf Krauss contacted the Russian consul in Chicago to see if Witte would be amenable to meeting with a Jewish delegation during the peace conference. In fact, Witte proved eager to meet with representatives of the Jewish community. This was a strategic play on Witte's part. He viewed the imminent peace conference as a chance to burnish Russia's reputation in America. Americans had an antipathy for Russia, and that affected a real consequence for Russia's war effort. The Japanese had been able to float war bonds on the American market and thus finance their military efforts. But the Russians had been kept out of the American markets. If negotiations in Portsmouth failed and the war dragged on, Witte hoped that by an improved image of Russia in the American mind might benefit Russia financially and therefore militarily. Witte knew it would take real work to reverse Russia's unfavorable standing in the United States, and he believed that it was America's Jews who were responsible for prejudicing their Gentile neighbors and leaders against Russia. This is something of an anti-Semitic stereotype that Jews are puppeteers, that they're basically sock puppeting their Gentile leaders in majority Christian countries, and whenever a nation does something that people don't like, somehow the Jews are behind the scenes. But Witte didn't just peddle in this stereotype, he genuinely believed it. And he thought that meeting with Jewish leaders in Portsmouth might go some way towards improving American perceptions writ large of Russia. When word came that Witte was amenable, Krauss began assembling a delegation of Jews to convene with the Russian statesmen. A natural and necessary choice was Jacob Schiff, who, if you were here for my earlier talk, you know the name. Schiff was the closest thing American Jewry had to a de facto spokesperson. He was a successful financier who was generous in his philanthropy and highly active in Jewish causes. Now, Schiff had reservations about joining this delegation in Portsmouth. He told a confidant, "I have been urged to meet with Mr. Witte to discuss Jewish affairs, but I have fought shy of them. First, because I know it can do no good, and second, because I do not wish to have it said that I went to discuss Russian finance with Mr. Witte." You see, Schiff had been the single most important person in stymieing Russia's bid to float war bonds, not just on the American markets, but also in the European markets, where Schiff had considerable sway. And he was disinclined to lend his ears to the complaints of a Russian nation that itself was deaf to the lamentations of its Jewish community. But the meeting with Witte would move ahead either way, and Schiff would ultimately put aside his misgivings to participate. 3 others were tapped for the occasion. Of course, Oscar Strauss, the most respected Jew in America. He had served in multiple presidential administrations, including Roosevelt's, representing TR at The Hague, and he was a close personal advisor and friend of Roosevelt's. And Strauss, in his prior career as an ambassador, had seemed to cultivate a diplomatic finesse that Jacob Schiff hadn't seemed to in his career on Wall Street. Joining them was Adolf Lewison, whose profile was very similar to Schiff's. They were both German-born, New Yorkers by choice, successful in business, and charitable with their philanthropy. Rounding out the party was the brilliantly named Isaac Newton Seligman. Seligman was part of one of America's most politically connected and prosperous Jewish families. He had been exchanging letters with TR since the 1890s. Although the Roosevelt administration had no formal involvement with this pending Jewish meeting in Portsmouth, Roosevelt wanted to be a behind-the-scenes player, and he meets with Strauss and Seligman in advance of their meeting with Witte and urges them to keep him informed of their developments in New Hampshire. Count Witte's journey to Portsmouth first took him through New York for a short day of a few days. And as his ship approached the New York harbor, he found that a cadre of onlookers and reporters who had not been content to wait on shore for his arrival had a flotilla of vessels to greet him in the waters of New York harbor. He was not difficult for them to spot. Witte had a massive frame, 6'6", with broad shoulders. When Witte finally docked, he took a car to his, or a carriage actually, to his hotel, the best hotel in New York at the time, the St. Regis, and he found that his lavish suite featured a balcony where they had hung a massive Russian flag. At the behest of Roosevelt, Witte enjoyed the protection of the Secret Service, and in this brief stay in New York, Witte thought that this was an initial opportunity to begin his strategic PR campaign to burnish Russia's image. And to that end, on his second day in New York, he traveled to the Lower East Side, or as he called it, the Jewish ghetto. He spoke Russian there with some of the Russian Jewish refugees, and he later explained in his memoirs that in his interactions with American Jews on this trip, he aimed to behave, quote, with democratic simplicity and without a shadow of snobbishness in view of the considerable influence of the Jews on the press. Here again, we see this kind of anti-Semitic trope. That day, he took a train out to Oyster Bay to meet with President Roosevelt at the latter's Sagamore Hill estate. Witte was underwhelmed by Roosevelt's home, and he later sneered that it looked like, and I quote, the ordinary summer house of a burgher of ordinary means. Witte was even less impressed by the meal inside. He later complained, the luncheon was more than simple, and for a European, almost indigestible. He continued, I noticed that, generally speaking, people ate very poorly in America. Witte, who was maligned on the world stage for representing a nation that was a paragon of barbarity, had the gall to criticize Roosevelt's lunch for lacking tablecloths and wine. The president, for his part, took advantage of the meal to try to coax Witte into considering terms that the Japanese might actually accept themselves, an early indication that even though Roosevelt was not formally a part of the peace conference, he would be an important behind-the-scenes player. The Japanese and the Russians wanted to engage in bilateral negotiations, but Roosevelt, as we'll see, was arguably more important than either of those parties. When the delegations from Japan and Russia surfaced in Portsmouth several days later, this sleepy seaside village of colonial homes and leafy streets came alive. Onlookers packed roadsides that were festooned with flags and banners. They wanted to catch a glimpse of the diplomats as they rode in open carriages down a processional route. New Hampshire state troops bedecked in yellow and blue kept the throngs at bay. The spectators cheered both the Russian and Japanese envoys. Witte, for his part, returned the favor by tipping his silk hat to the crowds. The parties disembarked at the courthouse in Portsmouth, where the governor formally welcomed them to New Hampshire. At the expense of the American taxpayer, the delegations would stay at the Wentworth Hotel, which still stands to this day as one of the last surviving examples of a kind of grand, palatial, Gilded Age era hotel where East Coast patricians used to spend their summers. When they arrived to the Wentworth, the Japanese took the elevator up to their suites, but the Russians opted to take the stairs, perhaps a fitting metaphor given that the negotiations ahead would prove more onerous for the defeated Russians. The bilateral negotiations between the delegations did not actually take place in Portsmouth. Technically, every day the parties would travel to an island just across the Piscataqua River that was officially part of Maine. It was actually controlled by the U.S. Navy, and the Navy had facilities where the delegations could meet, and even more importantly, communications infrastructure that would allow the diplomats to easily cable their respective capitals, Tokyo and St. Petersburg. The American officials who played host in Portsmouth took great pains to ensure that the daily cuisine was equal to the occasion, but Witte remained underwhelmed, confining himself to a meager diet of grains and vegetables. He later reflected, quote, "It is highly dangerous to eat the ordinary food which is served in America. I arrived at the conclusion that Americans have no culinary taste and that they can eat almost anything that comes in their way, even if it is not fresh." When a Japanese negotiator fell ill during peace talks, Witte, of course, blamed the food. Nor was Witte terribly pleased with the Wentworth's accommodations. The light in his room was disagreeable to his eyes, and owing to his large size, he struggled to squeeze himself into the bathtub, squeezing his ankle and twisting it in the process. Meanwhile, reporters had poured into Portsmouth from across the country and around the world, from Rome, London, Tokyo, Frankfurt. On Witte's fifth day in town, during a break in the peace deliberations, and with his meeting with the Jewish delegation imminent later that day, Witte finally sat down for an extended interview with an American paper, giving an exclusive to the Boston Globe. He spoke in a cadence that was at once animated yet deliberate, and he shared strikingly frank views about the Jewish people. Witte griped, "The Jews in America possess great influence and have quite naturally used that influence to destroy American sympathy for Russia, to do all that is possible to enlist sympathy for the Japanese." Witte must have realized that he sounded anti-Semitic and conspiratorial because he quickly hedged, quote, "I do not say this with any bitterness." Despite Witte's self-directed resolution to present a friendlier face to Jews, it appears he could not help but peddle in the hackneyed trope of the Jew as duplicitous puppet master. In his interview with the Boston Globe, Witte also repeated the oft-expressed Russian sentiment that American Jews and the U.S. government generally had no right to comment on Russia's treatment of its Jewish population because that was an internal affair and therefore beyond the bounds of external commentary. He closed the interview by suggesting that it was not wise for him to say too much in advance of his meeting with the Jewish leaders, but he had said plenty already. That same day, members of the Jewish delegation turned up in Portsmouth. Oscar Strauss spoke to the press, and in his remarks to reporters, he called for the repeal of hundreds of discriminatory laws targeting Russian Jews. Strauss evoked the language of the Declaration of Independence, saying, "We will ask Monsieur Witte," and he uses the French here because French was considered the language of diplomacy, We will ask Monsieur Witte that the Jews in Russia be accorded the same right to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as others in that country have. That is what we ask, no more, no less, to use President Roosevelt's effective phrase, end quote. Here Strauss was referencing TR's famous line that everyone merits, quote, a square deal because he is entitled to no more and should receive no less. Strauss also sought to preempt speculation in the press that he was there to effectively purchase civil rights for Russian Jews in exchange for war loans. Strauss clarified, this is in no way involved with any financial question. It is purely and simply a matter of humanity. Although loans were not officially on the agenda, the New York Times surmised that the topic could not have been far from Witte's mind. The Times recounted that Russia had been walled off from the American bond market and had struggled to finance its war effort. And as a consequence of its military struggles, a Russian nation that historically had been obstinate in the face of international protest about its anti-Semitism was now subjecting itself to a remonstrance by American Jews. The Times called it a, quote, extraordinary spectacle. To be sure, no explicit quid pro quo was on the table. Loans were not even to be discussed, but it was plain for all to see that if Russia made meaningful moves towards Jewish emancipation, it might well unburden them in their finances. Witte received his Jewish visitors in his room at the Wentworth Hotel at 8:45 in the evening. They were joined by the Russian ambassador to the United States, who had come up from Washington, D.C., as well as by Witte's translator. In the ensuing discussion, the Jewish delegation argued to Witte that Russia could not rightly claim that Americans had no prerogative to comment on Russia's internal treatment of its Jewish community because Russia's treatment of its Jews was prompting a mass exodus of Russian Jews to the United States, thereby rendering the issue international in its character. But even if immigration gave them just cause to state their grievances, immigration could not alone resolve Russia's Jewish question. From their perspective, Russia, after all, had, by almost an order of 3-1, the biggest Jewish community of any country in the world. There were simply too many millions of Russian Jews to easily displace them onto other countries. The Jewish deputation also assured Witte that Russia had nothing to fear from emancipating its Jews. They said, look at the Jew in Germany, in England, in France. They all prove that when a Jew is given equality, they become loyal citizens. The Jewish delegation was also keenly aware that Witte had fully internalized the anti-Semitic belief that Jews were puppet masters controlling their Gentile overlords, and instead of pushing back against that, they sought to exploit it for their benefit. And they asked Witte to consider the detriment to Russia if American Jews use their power to persuade their government to maintain an icy relationship with the Tsar's regime. In their words, can it be expected that the influence which the American Jew is gaining upon public opinion will be exerted to the advantage of the country, which systematically degrades his brethren and makes their fate almost unendurable? For his part, Witte sought to stake out some middle ground between the typical Russian denial that there was anything amiss with Russia's Jewish community and how they're treated on the one hand, and actually acknowledging the full extent of Jewish deprivation on the other. He suggested that the fate of Jews in Russia had been exaggerated in the international press. Now, at that time, the Tsar, under pressure from domestic unrest, had agreed to institute a legislative assembly, the Duma, which was scheduled to meet at that point in 2 months' time. And Witte expressed his hope that the Duma would dismantle the country's anti-Semitic legal code. But this aspiration was wholly without teeth because the Duma would be merely a consultative body. It had no actual legal authority. The Tsar setting up a Duma, it was an empty gesture towards democracy to mollify revolutionary fervor, but it would only serve to preserve Russian absolutism for the Tsar. And the meeting between Witte and his Jewish visitors was not without its tenser moments. In one instance, Jacob Schiff motioned towards Witt's translator, who was a Russian national of Jewish background. And Schiff asked Witte, "Will you please tell me why you, as a Russian, have full rights in your country and why he, also a Russian, has none?" Witte responded with an abstract expression of support for Jewish emancipation, but he suggested that emancipation should take place in piecemeal measures rather than all at once, because if they did, in a sweeping measure, grant Jews equality, it would provoke intense hostility from their Gentile neighbors in Russia. Now, this answer did not satisfy Schiff and his fellow Jewish leaders. Unsurprisingly, they countered that if the Russian populace was going to take such umbrage at civic freedom for Russia's Jews, all the better to do it in one singular moment and confine Russian hostility to that particular point in time. Alternatively, if Witte's proposal for partial emancipation was adopted, it would only serve to stoke anew the irritation among Russians toward their Jewish neighbors in an endless succession of aggravating reforms. At that time, Russia was trying to ward off revolutionary forces that sought an overthrow of the Tsar and hoped to establish a republic. Now, Schiff, in particular, against that backdrop, was irked when Witte suggested that the American Jewish leadership use their influence with their Russian co-religionists to sway them away from revolutionary movements and towards fidelity to the Tsar. Schiff replied bluntly, "We have no such influence." Now, in truth, only a small minority of Jews in Russia were involved with revolutionary movements. Most Jews were too focused on the daily survival of their hard-scrabble lives to engage in politics. But Schiff did not reject the allegation that Jews were involved with revolutionary fervor. Rather, he justified it. He said with edge in his voice that they were wholly legitimate in their radicalism. Witte, in turn, dismissed revolutionary aspirations as quixotic, and he declared that the end of the Tsarist dynasty would not materialize in their lifetime. In Witte's words, "The Romanovs will rule Russia for 100 years. By the way, he would be off by about 90. At one point, Schiff pounded his fist on the table in frustration, but despite the tension, the meeting was characterized by a reasonable degree of cordiality. Witte would later suggest that Schiff's stridency had been toned down by the more balanced judgment of other members of the delegation, and he singled out Oscar Strauss for making a particularly good impression. Now, even if Witte was not inclined to recognize the full depth of Jewish deprivation in Russia, the fact that he had acknowledged any of it was something of a breakthrough. Witte offered to resume his discussion with the Jewish leaders in New York following the Portsmouth peace talks. Meanwhile, the press had been patiently awaiting outside Witte's suite for the Jewish leaders to emerge, as a meeting that was supposed to take 1 hour was stretching to 3. Finally, just before midnight, the Jewish delegation appeared. Jacob Schiff gave a mixed statement to the paper, suggesting at one moment that he did not think that the talks would actually change facts on the ground for Russian Jews, but in the next breath suggested that perhaps something beneficial would come from it. For Strauss's part, he added, "There is nothing more for us to do. Our mission is done." As with the peace negotiations themselves, Roosevelt was officially uninvolved, but in reality, an important behind-the-scenes player. Recall that TR had asked members of the Jewish delegation to keep him abreast of developments in New Hampshire, and right after the meeting, 3 of the 5 Jewish leaders dutifully dashed off letters to the president. Jacob Schiff recounted at great length the exchange between them and Witte. Seligman relayed to Roosevelt that Witte expected, or at least claimed to expect, that the Duma would reverse the discriminatory laws targeting Jews. But Seligman had his doubts, confessing to Roosevelt, "The past promises and subsequent non-performances on the part of Russia naturally lead us to feel distrustful, and we have some misgivings as to his utterances." Meanwhile, the president's most trusted Jewish confidant, Oscar Strauss, relayed to the president that Witte had expressed a preference for gradual emancipation, and that the Jewish leaders in turn had responded that they wanted, and I quote, "equal rights, no more, no less, and without delay." With Jewish leaders set to meet Witte yet again, Roosevelt wanted to personally lend himself to their ongoing cause. But he first had to make finding a peace accord between the Russians and the Japanese his top priority. TR assured Oscar Strauss, "I am greatly interested in what you tell me about the Russian-Jew question and will, of course, do anything I can subsequent to the peace negotiations being out of the way, as I do not want to complicate the latter." Indeed, Roosevelt would soon find himself frenetically working back channels in a bid to salvage the precarious discussions between the Russian and Japanese, which seemed like they might well end in failure. Meanwhile, the Jewish summit with Witte was garnering front-page headlines across the country. From coast to coast, Americans read about the Jewish leaders who challenged the high-ranking Russian statesmen over the plight of their embattled co-religionists. Right here in Cleveland, the Plain Dealer declared that the Jewish meeting with Witte was, quote, far overshadowing in significance the peace talks. St. Louis's Jewish newspaper, called the Jewish Voice, vividly captured the significance of the moment. Quote, "Great and dramatic is the spectacle presented tonight." The paper continued, "Picture, if you will, the mighty bear, rampant and aggressive, with its teeth so often displayed in harsh snarls, humbled before the much despised Jew." After years of practiced obstinance, the Russians were actually hearing a humanitarian message from Jewish lips, no less. Opinions in the mainstream press differed over whether the meeting would actually affect change on the ground for Russian Jewry. The Idaho Daily Statesman optimistically suggested that Witte, in seeing the success of the American Jewish community, could not help but view American Jewry as a model for what Russian Jews could become if granted equality. But the Cleveland Plain Dealer was less sanguine. Here in Cleveland, the paper derided Witte as little more than a stooge for the Tsar, in whose hands the fate of Russian Jewry ultimately rested. Should the peace talks fail, the Plain Dealer predicted, Witte would, quote, "be disgraced for all time by his weathercock of a master." When the Jewish representatives in Portsmouth returned to their respective cities, they tried to strike an optimistic note in their remarks to the press. B'nai B'rith President Adolf Krauss, back in Chicago, announced to the papers there, "Better times are coming for our people." And he anticipated that the new Russian Duma would indeed dismantle the country's anti-Semitic legal code. Meanwhile, Seligman, despite confessing to Roosevelt his misgivings about Witte, told the New York press that Witte would carry their message to the Tsar and that that message would bear fruit. Members of the Jewish delegation were, of course, incentivized to depict the meeting in favorable terms, lest they preemptively undermine its goals. Other voices in the Jewish community were not as hopeful. In Los Angeles, the Jewish newspaper, the B'nai B'rith Messenger, stated sharply, "This will have no effect on the Tsar's subjects." And those Jews actually living in Russia were similarly dubious. In the eyes of many, Witte's reputation for relative liberality aside, it was simply not enough to counterbalance Russia's inveterate Jew hatred. The members of the Jewish delegation were frustrated that the press frequently depicted their meeting with Witte for exactly what it was not, an exchange of war loans for Russian Jewish civil rights. In South Dakota, for instance, the Aberdeen Daily News erroneously reported, quote, "The well-known ability of the Jews to drive a good bargain is demonstrated again in the proposition of American bankers of that race to loan the Tsar all the money he needs, provided he will grant reforms in Russia which will deliver the Jewish race from persecution." This was intended as a compliment by the paper, but this kind of commentary only reinforced tropes about Jews as cunning. Strauss and Seligman made sure to disabuse Roosevelt of any misinformation he might have been picking up from the papers. Witte himself publicly corroborated their claims that loans had not even been discussed, but the Plain Dealer remained unconvinced, writing, "The numerous denials were cleverly calculated, both by Monsieur Witte and these representatives of the great Jewish banking houses, to befog the casual observance as to the real object of their visit." It appears that Jews and Russians alike could not so easily escape stereotyping about duplicity. Meanwhile, it looked like the Russo-Japanese talks may well careen towards collapse, but for the efforts of Theodore Roosevelt himself. The warring parties were mired in protracted wrangling over indemnities and land claims, spurring Roosevelt to fire off a rapid succession of cables to Portsmouth, to Tokyo, and to St. Petersburg. The principal obstacle to peace was convincing the pride-wounded Russians to agree to terms that offended their sense of honor, even though the terms were wholly reasonable given Russia's poor military showing. At first, TR appeared unable to finesse a compromise between the two sides. But in late August, just as it looked like the diplomats were going to leave for their respective countries empty-handed, the two sides came to terms. The president told a congressional ally, "It's a mighty good thing for Russia, and it's a mighty good thing for Japan, and it's a mighty good thing for me too." Indeed, heads of state and newspapers the world over lauded Roosevelt for his pivotal part in a conference that technically he didn't even attend. Having faced criticism earlier in his presidency for engaging a brand of cowboy diplomacy that many viewed as reckless, Roosevelt could now justifiably claim the mantle of peacemaker. Oscar Strauss gushed in a letter to the president that many people who, quote, "only a few months ago looked at you as the scourge of war, now praise you as the angel of peace." For TR's role in the Russo-Japanese peace talks, he earned the Nobel Peace Prize, the first American to win a Nobel in any category. And he used the winnings from the Nobel Peace Prize to set up a new endeavor to promote harmonious relationships between capital and labor, trusting none other than his trusted Jewish advisor, Oscar Strauss, to steward that endeavor. The signing of the peace treaty took place in early September in a brick building in the Navy Yard in the Piscataqua River, where the two sides had spent weeks wrangling over terms. After 3 days of gloomy weather, finally, on the day of the ceremony, the sun appeared as if on cue. All of Portsmouth eagerly awaited the signal, a 19-gun salute from the Navy Yard battery that would indicate that the diplomats had affixed their names to the historic document. The salute was expected at 3 o'clock, but 3 o'clock came with no signal from the battery's gunner. One agonizing minute after the next elapsed. Finally, upon the last pen stroke in the conference room, a State Department official ran outside and yelled, "All signed at 3:47, prompting a Navy seaman to wave a red flag at the battery gunner some 50 yards away. A newspaper recorded, "The opening shot of the salute rang out on the clear air of the soft September afternoon, proclaiming peace between Russia and Japan." A cacophony quickly ensued. The churches of Portsmouth began tolling their bells, ships in the harbor blew their whistles, and a Navy band burst out into a fanfare. Amid the noise, a State Department official phoned Oyster Bay to inform TR of the good news. Back inside the conference room, champagne was opened, and in an indication of Roosevelt's centrality to the peace accord, the American president was toasted even before the Russian Tsar or the Japanese emperor. At 5 o'clock, the Russian envoy journeyed across the Kittery Bridge into Portsmouth, which was densely packed with festive crowds. Witte was due to attend a local church service, but he struggled to make his way through the crush of onlookers who kept extending their hands to him. Witte would later explain in his memoirs that handshakes were, quote, "the usual expression of attention with Americans." When Witte finally passed into the church, he found that the interior had been delightfully adorned with floral arrangements. And in a sign that this new era of peace might well hasten a new era of Jewish-Christian relations in Russia, rabbis walked together with a Russian Orthodox priest in a procession behind a choir that was intoning a song of peace. 4 days after the peace conference concluded, Witte was back at Oyster Bay as Roosevelt's dinner guest. Earlier that day, Roosevelt had hosted the Japanese negotiators for lunch, and now Roosevelt was serving Witte a final, perhaps inedible supper. Following that meal, TR sent a letter to a friend and retired British statesman about his dinner with Witte. Now, Wittey's diplomatic credentials aside, he was not known for his subtlety or his tact. Roosevelt put it, "I suppose Wittey is the best man Russia could have at the head of her affairs at present. I cannot say that I liked him, for I thought his bragging and bluster not only foolish, but shockingly vulgar." The president's self-professed contempt for Wittey aside, he felt encouraged by their discussions about various topics, including the oppression of Russian Jewry. Weeks earlier, TR had promised Oscar Strauss that he would take up their cause, and the president made good on his word, lending the weight of the American presidency to the mission of the Jewish delegation. Precisely what Roosevelt said to Wittey remains unknown, but Roosevelt did share in his letter to his British friend that he aimed to, quote, "get a little alleviation of the condition of the Jews out of this peace conference as what you might call a byproduct." Roosevelt continued, "Wittey also expressed his views about religion and freedom of conscience in a way that would command hearty support from you or me." The president felt sufficiently optimistic after his meal with Wittey to send him a follow-up letter the following day. And he brought up a topic that the Jewish delegation had not broached, the passport question, which, if you were not at my talk on Friday, I'll just say in a sentence that at that time, Russia refused to give visas to American Jews to visit Russian territory. Despite assurances the prior year that Russia would reverse its passport restrictions on American Jewry, no reforms had been forthcoming. Roosevelt pressed Wittey, "In furtherance of our conversation of last evening, I beg you to consider the question of granting passports to reputable American citizens of Jewish faith." Roosevelt's letter suggested that Russia had every right to bar any given American from Russian territory, provided that refusal rested on that individual's rectitude, not their religion. The president's letter came with a request that Wittey forward it to Tsar Nicholas himself. On Wittey's final morning in New York before returning to Russia, he and the Russian ambassador visited their Japanese counterparts at the Waldorf Astoria before returning to their own hotel, the St. Regis. And there at the St. Regis, Wittey yet again met with a Jewish delegation. 3 of the 5 from Portsmouth were present. There was the diplomat Oscar Strauss, the banker Isaac Newton Seligman, and the B'nai B'rith president Adolf Krauss. Krauss had come all the way from Chicago for what was merely a ceremonial send-off. Having already fully aired their views in Portsmouth, this letter exercise was really just a gesture of diplomatic politesse. Immediately afterward that day, to what was Shirley Seligman's continued annoyance, he continued to fend off queries from the press about whether Jewish-run banks would now give war loans to Russia, which was a curious question, particularly because they had just achieved peace. But he insisted the matter of a loan was not even suggested. Meanwhile, Wittey set off for a ritzy lunch with the Russian ambassador at the Union Club on Fifth Avenue before heading to his steamship to leave for his journey across the Atlantic. Aboard the steamer shortly before leaving, Wittey gave a decidedly ambivalent statement to the papers. He expressed hope for a new era of equality for Jews, but he then said, vaguely and ominously, regrettable things cannot always be foreseen or prevented. As Wittey well understood, the cessation of war beyond Russia's borders would not necessarily forge peace within them. It remained to be seen whether Russia's internal discord would ultimately improve or imperil life for the Tsar's Jewish subjects. Wittey returned home to a Russia that was roiled by turmoil alarming even by the standards of 1905. A cascading series of strikes had morphed into a general strike that brought Russia's cities to the brink of paralysis. Wittey pleaded with Tsar Nicholas that only a transition to a constitutional monarchy could mollify the revolutionary fervor sweeping the country. The reform-minded minister drew up a memorandum for Wittey's consideration that called for universal manhood suffrage, a Duma that had real and not merely consultative power, and civil liberties for minority groups like Jews. Under this scheme, the Tsar would retain the title of emperor, and the Duma's laws would be subject to his veto. Nicholas did not thrill to the prospect of significantly eroding his autocratic rule. But the dysfunction of Russian society was too plain for even an intransigent despot to ignore much longer. By the end of October, the Tsar begrudgingly issued what was known as the October Manifesto, based on Witte's memorandum, in which freedom of conscience was exalted as a core element of genuine personal inviolability. This was a remarkable concession for millions of Jews who had spent years living under the heel of Russian persecution. Witte's promise to the American Jewish leaders to do what he could for their co-religionists in Russia was now improbably realized in an official decree bearing the imperial signature. But even as its ink was freshly drying, the manifesto became a dead letter. The day after its promulgation, thousands of Russians would greet news of civic freedom for their Jewish neighbors with a rampage of anti-Semitic violence never before seen in the dark history of their empire. So what lesson might we glean from the story of peace at Portsmouth? This story teaches us the limits of diplomacy. For all the maneuvering and strategizing on the part of Jewish leaders and President Roosevelt, all the conferences, all the meetings, the letters, the press statements ultimately meant little in a Russian society where the rule of law was collapsing and an age-old hatred culminated in a wave of mass pogroms that claimed thousands of Jewish lives. Amid the blood-stained rubble, many Russian Jewish survivors saw only one solution, a solution with deep roots in Jewish tradition: exodus. There was no Jewish future in the Tsar's dominions. Emigration alone could spare Jewish lives. Some Russian Jews found their way to the ancient deserts of the Holy Land, but far more of them turned their gaze westward to a young country with a young leader, to Theodore Roosevelt's America, where they hoped to find in this new republic their new Jerusalem. Thank you.
Another fascinating and excellent presentation of a part of history that I did not know much about. So thank you, Dr. Porwancher. We're going to open it up for a few questions. If you are online, you can either text me or chat in the Zoom also. And so we'll open the floor. I see a question in the back from Yossi. If you can speak loud, and then if you can repeat.
Sure. A Jewish, yeah.
Restricted immigration for Jews at the beginning of the century.
I'm really, yeah, so I'll thank you for that. I'll repeat the question. Well, first, let me just say to the rabbi's comment that, sometimes people say, oh, I had no idea about Roosevelt and the connections with Jewish history, and no one's ever written a book about it before. My book will be the first, so everybody's off the hook if you didn't know. As to your question, and it's such an important one, restrictions on Jewish immigration. I addressed this at length in the Roosevelt book, which is not out yet. You have to wait a couple years. You occupy yourselves with the Hamilton book in the meantime. But the question of Jewish immigration to the United States is a really important one in my book. Beginning in the 1890s, there is an effort by a certain subset of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants to try to restrict immigration because of hostility to Jews, but also hostility to other people from Southern and Eastern Europe. They weren't that thrilled about the Italians and the Greeks either, but they were particularly unhappy about Jewish immigration. There were more Jews who came to America in the years of Theodore Roosevelt's presidency than in the previous couple centuries combined. So it's an extraordinary mushrooming of an exodus from Eastern Europe to America precisely because of the kind of violence that is traumatizing the Jewish community. And so there is certainly a movement afoot to try to restrict Jewish immigration. Now, the Jewish community is very actively involved in resisting those efforts. And what we find is that they are initially quite successful. But by the 1920s, after Theodore Roosevelt's lifetime, the xenophobia reigns supreme in the United States, and they're able to pass significantly restrictive immigration legislation. And so the American Jewish community had been successful in staving off that kind of codification of bigotry for a long time. But they were ultimately not successful. And I think it's an important question that you ask, in part because it speaks to a broader truth in American history, which is that there are always forces of anti-Semitism at play in American history. And there's also always voices of tolerance and equality. And the degree to which one is ascendant versus the other changes depending on which generation you're in. And one of the things that the history of American Jewry teaches us is that Jewish advocacy matters. Jews' willingness to stand up, to organize, to find allies among our Gentile neighbors, and to push our leadership to pursue policies that are favorable to Jews and protect Jewish life and liberty does move the needle. It makes a difference. It's the hard work of living in a democracy, and for Jews, oftentimes that hard work is a matter of life and death. So the stakes are high and the lessons are important. Thank you for that question. Yeah, so the question is, after the Portsmouth Peace Conference, what comes of Roosevelt and his advocacy for Russian Jews? This is a really good question and a really complicated question, which I'll take up at length in the Roosevelt book. So the October Manifesto sparks this massive wave of unrest in Russia, and you have a series of pogroms that dwarf anything that had previously happened in Russian history. And the toll on Jewish life and livelihood is astounding. Before the Holocaust, the Kishinev pogrom in Russia in 1903 had become the symbol of Jewish suffering, but the kinds of bloodletting that we see of Jews, even in one particular city of, I think Odessa, there was, some people estimate 800 Jewish lives taken in a single day. It's breathtaking. The Roosevelt administration is actually reluctant to try to speak out in international forums about the pogroms because the rule of law was completely collapsing. And Roosevelt believed, and he may have been correct in this belief, he might not have been, but he believed that if the American president, absent any kind of rule of law from Russia on which he could, any sort of head of state with real power and real control over the Russian nation that Roosevelt could communicate with, that outside commentary from an American president might only serve to exacerbate violence against Jews. Now, a number of Jews were deeply concerned about that. Some Jews agreed with Roosevelt, many others did not. Now, was Roosevelt just conveniently saying, well, the rule of law has collapsed, I don't really want to do anything? I actually don't think so, because what we see later is that by the late spring of 1906, the rule of law had been restored in Russia and the emperor was once again firmly in power. And yet you still have pogroms happening, and at that point, Roosevelt is willing to pressure the Russian regime. And so if we take Roosevelt at his word, his behavior is consistent with that. Now, I don't say this as any sort of apologia for Roosevelt. I think that the symbolic power of the American president speaking out against the senseless violence visited on Russia's Jewish community, even in the absence of the rule of law, would have been an important humanitarian step. But the short answer to your question is Roosevelt's willingness to spend political capital to support the cause of Russian Jewry depended on the exigencies of the moment, and at different times of his presidency, we see different reactions from Roosevelt. There's not one consistent through line. So thank you for that question. Yeah, that's right. And so you have, oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, let me repeat the question. Thank you for the reminder. So the observation, I should say, is about how a number of Russian Jews ended up joining the Bolshevik Revolution. And this is absolutely true. It's certainly not the case that every Russian Jew en masse moved to the United States, in 1906. A number of Jews do. Some historians estimate that for every Jew who went to the Holy Land, there were 20 who came to the United States. But there are, of course, a number of Jews who stay in Russia. And there are additional waves of pogroms that happen even after the Bolshevik movement. And to this day, there are still Jews in Russia, of course, as we all know. And so there wasn't necessarily one answer that Jews found, but many Jews did try to make it to the United States, and my research is particularly focused on those Jews because ultimately my research is about Roosevelt and the relationship between the American Jewish community and the Russian Jewish community. But if I was writing a book just purely on the history of Russian Jewry, there's a lot to be said about Jews in the Bolshevik movement, and you could understand the appeal of the Bolshevik movement to Jews because it promised to treat Jews on an equality. But of course, it's not the case that in the era of the Soviet Union, Jews were treated as citizens of the first order. So it's a really important point. I think it's true of my family. I'm sure it's true of many of your families that precisely the era of pogroms that I'm talking about from the late 19th to early 20th century, prompting these Eastern European Jews to come to the United States, that's the story of our families for so many of us.
If I can ask the last question for this morning, obviously, at least I'm hearing your presentation, your research, your theses, in light of everything that's happening now in Russia and Ukraine, and wanted to just sort of see if you're willing to share a comment, how your research reflects that, and as not just a constitutional legal professor, but as a professor of Jewish history who has done some work with Russian Jewish history, as you shared a little bit, sort of what is your comment? And just for a little bit of background, we actually have a sister city both in Cleveland and in Russia. Our sister city in Israel is Beit Sha'an. We have a sister city of St. Petersburg also, and we know that on the ground in St. Petersburg, it's a very perilous time for our Jewish brothers and sisters, and just wanted to see your comment on the situation.
Yeah, thank you. I think that there's something striking about how unoriginal anti-Semitism seems to be in every generation. They just keep relying on the same tropes that go back hundreds of years. What's so striking to me, and I appreciate the rabbi's question, because we see Putin accuse a nation run by a Jew of somehow promoting Nazism. And it is like a sort of weird wrinkle in how somehow Jewish issues become embroiled in Russian conspiratorial thinking, right? And it's yet another reminder that I think that the Jew in some way, shape, and form is never that far from the Russian psyche. Now, as far as what lessons we might take from today, I think one, the echoes of history are always more pronounced than we can even realize. There's people who have done research on anti-Semitism in the Middle Ages and then anti-Semitism, in the modern era of the last couple hundred years, and found that in Europe, communities that were the most likely to spill Jewish blood 800 years ago were also the most likely to do it, 80 or 180 years ago. And so Ukraine, which was, part of Russian territory in the period that I'm talking about, that was the main site of these pogroms that I'm talking about. And so I think that it is worth acknowledging the, I'm trying to think about how to phrase this. It is unsurprising, perhaps, that a place that has been the site of so much destruction and death, not just for Jews, but particularly for Jews, once again, is playing that tragic role in world history. And it strikes me as well that the Russians, at least the Russian leadership, seems to be motivated by a sort of psychological need and an illusion of grandeur and an unwillingness to countenance facts on the ground that is so similar to the Tsarist era that I think there are maybe two lessons to be gleaned from this. First, Putin, I don't think, is trying to revivify the era of the Soviet Union. He's trying to revivify Tsarist Russia, right? His vision is much closer to Tsar Nicholas than it is to, somebody like Stalin. And I think that we, because he was a KGB officer, people think, and because the Soviet Union is in living memory, we think in those terms. But Putin, even by his own historical essays, which by the way are riddled with factual inaccuracies, his own historical essays are reaching much deeper back into the Tsarist era as he explains Russia's dubious claims to various territory. And the last point I would make is that Russia, because it is motivated and willing to privilege these really bizarre psychological needs over its own material interests, Russia is not going to be persuadable by the traditional diplomatic suite of carrots and sticks that might work with other countries. And so Russia is willing to let its own people suffer, is willing to destroy its own economy, is willing to let the machinery of war chew up Russian lives of soldiers who are untrained and without proper weaponry to no real end. And so I think that we have to try to step outside of our own Western thinking about how nations act and try as best as possible to understand the perversion of the Russian psyche in order to begin to grapple with what techniques, what strategies we can use to try to bring this war to a close on terms that preserve the life and liberty for the Ukrainian people. So thank you for that question, and thank you so much to those of you tuning in, to those of you who are here with me in person. This has been a wonderful morning, a wonderful weekend, and Chris and I extend our deepest gratitude to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming to Cleveland, to sharing your amazing teachings and very interesting and fascinating work with us. And if you haven't yet picked up your copy, we are not selling them, but you can definitely get them online in various venues so that you can really delve into Dr. Porwancher's work. Thanks again. And he is going to be available for some questions. We're going to grab him for a minute. We haven't taken any photos for our own sort of publicity, so we're going to take a minute or two and do a few photos here, and then Dr. Porwancher has a couple hours before he and Kristen take off. Yeah, so I'm going to ask for, if Rebecca, if you're able to join us for a photo, and Cantor. And we'll take a couple photos, yeah.
And if there's time to see the scroll.
Yeah, well, then I'm gonna wait,
That's it.
I'm gonna wait. And thanks for those on Zoom, we're gonna turn off now.